And hello everyone, and welcome with our next installment of the Armchair Admirals. I'm Taki, and I will be trying to guide you through this evening. Unfortunately, we have to make do again without Mr. Conway, so I have to apologize for a slight delay because there were some last-minute tech difficulties, which Mr. Conway is usually much more capable of handling than I am. But well, trying my best. And we have also a new setup of guests. And this time I have to also excuse our beloved Jingles because, he bowed out from today. But we still have three guests who you can see now are, Dr. Alexander Clark, Jamie Seidel,
Hello.
and Drachinifel. And that means that we are kind of being taken over by the bilge pumps crew, which is generally those three gentlemen talking ship. So let's start with the introduction from our newest guest. So hello, and please tell us something about yourself.
Well, first of all, I suppose it's good morning from down under. Look, I'm probably the junior member of the bilge pumps. Basically, my area of interest, speciality, is the various armored flight deck aircraft carriers of World War II, which is mostly the Royal Navy, but does include the likes of Taiho and Midway. So that combined with a job that keeps me moderately busy with current affairs makes me part of the bilge pumps crew, which attempts to kind of look at current world events through historical eyes.
Yeah. And if you want to know anything about armored carriers, then there is a little link down below, and please go there and check out the site. There's also a YouTube channel, I believe, and a Twitter feed. So there's a lot of resources there.
Yeah.
Armored carriers,
I'm
everything.
obsessive, just like the rest of them.
Then we have Mr. Drachinifel, who you probably know, but still, let's do a quick intro.
So, yes, I am Drachinifel of Drachinifel, the YouTube channel, Drachinifel, the Twitter account, Drachinifel, the website, and as Dr. Clark keeps trying to remind me, soon to be Drachinifel, the flamethrower, because why not? I haven't managed to set myself on fire yet, obviously, but I'm working on it. So, yeah, stay tuned.
Okay, so that will be probably that will make headlines. So, last but not least, Dr. Alexander Clark, also the bilge pumps.
Also the bilge pumps. Yes, it was my idea to put bilge pumps together as a sort of easy listening naval history on current affairs thing, and I basically poached two of my best friends from what they were doing and said, you now owe your Friday mornings to me. No, actually, we were going to do for just 3 episodes, and it's turned into 43. And now we're on Armchair Admirals together. So,
yeah, I mean, Armchair Admirals.
All your naval histories does belong to us.
Yeah.
Armchair Admirals were also supposed to be shorter, so I know how these things snowball. So
yeah, basically, I'm Alex Clark. I'm Dr. Alex Clark. I'm a naval historian. I did my PhD at King's, and I have a YouTube channel, which is about the same thing. I have a Twitter, which is @AC_naval history. I have a Discord, and I spend my time. I'm lucky enough to earn my living being a naval historian. Just about earn my living being a naval historian. Please note, I'm junior academic. I am not one of the ones who've got the massive paychecks. Junior academic, but it is a good thing to be doing. And I would just like to add one thing. Jamie is in no way the junior member of Bilge Pumps. He puts himself down quite a lot, but he is not. Without him, as me and Drac would tell you, he's the one who keeps us to time and who makes sure that we actually behave and keep, broadly speaking, on topic. As anyone who's listened to the episodes when Jamie isn't available will be able to testify to. Without him, it wouldn't work. Basically.
Thank you for the introductions. And we will do the basic usual format. So we will quickly go over the battle. We will explore what happened and why. Well, we will try to explore why. And we will generally then answer the questions, and while doing so, run off on tangents. I mean, today's episode probably will not give us enough opportunities to bash BT, but maybe there will be an opportunity.
He was dead
in
and
a
buried by this point, so I'm happy.
To be fair, I can blame him because Chatfield was his protege. Chatfield was the first Sea Lord prior to World War II, and he was the guy who pushed through with the 14-inch guns for the King George V's. And he was also one of the people who tried to slow down the carrier building project. So, and stopped the next generation of tribal class destroyers which were planning on being built. So, you know, I can find a way to blame BT because it's his protege which is ruining the Royal Navy at the beginning of World War II. See?
Yeah.
I
Okay,
work hard at blaming BT. I do.
That's nice. Yes, I see the questions or comments already starting on the... Oh my. What have we started last time? All hail the Blackburn.
It spreads.
Oh god!
I think the terrible things has happened. But
Oh god! No.
actually, the question that I wanted to react to was no jingles today. Yes, no jingles today. He had to apologize. He had to excuse himself because, well, he's not feeling that well. So we have to do without him.
I think he did set us a challenge, though, that each of us has to work in the thing of 3 for 3,000 at some point. He did. I think he did set that challenge in a message.
So now I will actually use Drakenfell's feed. Sorry for this field solution, but I didn't have time to prepare this properly. Just to kick off the things that were happening, like the quick background to the battle. So here we can see the area of operation. Now Cape Matapan, it's an unusual name, but it's basically the westmost edge of the Crete, this beautiful island here. And the Crete is kind of strategic in the Mediterranean, as you can see with its position, and it's kind of halfway between the Africa and the Greece. And by the time the battle was happening, there was kind of unpleasantness going on in the Balkans. There was a attempted Italian invasion of Albania here, which didn't really go that well, and the attempted invasion of Greece, which went even worse. And the Great Britain was supporting Greece, sending some troop convoys to Greece from Alexandria down here. And obviously the Italian Navy didn't like that much. We have already touched...
Honestly, no. The Italian Navy didn't mind the troop convoys coming to
the
Greece
army
to
didn't
beat
like
up
it,
the
yes.
Italian army. No, what they just thought is there are some targets so we can go get them. But honestly, the Regia Marina had no qualms with the Italian army being beaten up. That really...
That is true. That much is true.
That basically didn't faze them at all.
Yeah, basically their boss had to come down on them and kind of...
yeah. I had to remind them that they were supposed to be stopping the convoys rather than
the
trying
enemy
to
were the
speed them in
British
and
and
going,
not
"Do you
the
want some
army.
fire
Yes.
support?"
In any case, the convoys were going basically between Alexandria and Athens, so they were kind of hard to reach for the Italian Navy. But still, the best area to intercept was probably right here. Well, the best, because obviously what's down here? Alexandria, the base of the Mediterranean fleet. So not really that ideal. At the same time, I will now vacate the screen again. Wait. Yeah. At the same time, the Italian Navy had also kind of limited resources after the Taranto escapade and all that. So they were able to still put together quite a potent force, right? On the paper for convoy
They
bashing.
always put together a potent force.
It's complicated. The Italian Navy started out the war with 1.8 million tons of fuel oil, and by this stage of the war, they'd already used up 1 million tons of that, and it was being refreshed at a rate of 50,000 tons per month from Germany, which was nowhere near enough, of course. So, they were obviously very, careful with how much fuel they used. And also, they were very, very aware after the appearance of HMS Illustrious a few months earlier of the danger of naval air power. So they were they decided very much to go with their fast fleet. So this is why it was Vittorio Veneto. It was the other battleships, while very heavily modernized, just simply weren't fast enough to give the admiral confidence of being able to escape if necessary.
Yeah, basically I would say the equation was very similar to the Japanese incursions to the Guadalcanal. That basically the Italian Navy wanted to be in and out before, like during the night, before the
the big difference being that the Italian Navy had absolutely no capability for night fighting.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Italian Navy had advantages in that their heavy cruiser strength was their big advantage. They had a strong concentration of heavy cruisers, but they have more battleships than the British technically do in the fleet. But the British have the advantage of an aircraft carrier, Illustrious, and later on Formidable, and the British also have. How do I put this? The advantage, the big advantage the British have at this point is Malta in terms of the reconnaissance it's offering and the signals they're able to pick up there, and with patrols going around there, because that is the big thing. The Italian Navy is lacking fuel. They're also lacking really reliable intelligence information, reconnaissance information. Their admirals are factoring in things like presuming their air force doesn't tell them when they spot stuff. There are often times where their senior officers are literally going, "We are presuming our air force is lying to us." That is part of their basic planning. And if you consider that with Britain in the Royal Navy, they have to occasionally nick stuff off the Royal Air Force because they take their time supplying it to them. Famously, before Taranto, a officer happens to wander over and nick something, but they do actually get it. They don't think they're lying to them.
I mean, the interesting thing here is, is the fog of war. But there's also a lot more going on to it there as well. So the whole reason why Matapan took place was that the Italian Navy was convinced that 2 of Cunningham's 3 battleships had just very recently been torpedoed by German torpedo bombers. So he was convinced that this new arrival aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, HMS Formidable, was not going to be able to sortie to defend the convoys because it itself could not be defended. Now, of course, that was based on a false report, an overly optimistic report from the torpedo bomber pilots. And also, of course, the German Enigma code had been cracked, and as well as the Italian naval cipher had been cracked. So the fact that there was a Sunderland that accidentally picked up the fleet as it left harbour was purely accidentally.
Yes.
And
it's like Britain has so many happy accidents in war.
Yeah.
Britain is a nation of happy accidents in wartime.
Now, I mean, obviously the Sunderland crew didn't know that they were told to be there at that time because of Enigma, but it meant that the Royal Navy had plausible deniability. But on top of that, though, the Italians had cracked the Royal Navy operational codes, so they could listen to the Sunderland, and the Sunderland only got a partial sighting report. It only spotted the heavy cruisers, so it signalled its sighting report of the heavy cruisers and then went silent for hours. So the admiral thought, yeah, okay, it's probably not enough to scare me back to harbour.
And of course, there's also, I think, from memory, this is the time when, of course, Cunningham goes for a very long pretend golf game.
Yeah,
Yes,
the club incident, yes.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't really a long golf game as far as I know. He just turned up in one of the exclusive clubs that the British knew was watched with a very large suitcase very late at night and just didn't seem to be willing to depart.
The middle of the afternoon, he turns up as if he's staying there for the few days. He makes sure he's seen by the Japanese ambassador.
The Japanese ambassador was regularly there playing, so yes.
Yes, and I think he does everything he can to make sure he's seen by the Japanese ambassador. It was almost, it was later in the war, you would say Cunningham was channeling his inner Montgomery. He was doing so much effort to make sure he was seen by this guy. I think he practically did everything apart from stand in front of him and go, "Hello, I am Admiral Cunningham. Report me as being here."
At the same time, though, he had ordered that the battleships put up their awnings for shade and all the rest of it, because he also knew that there were morning and afternoon reconnaissance flights. So it was the whole thing. It was giving your opposition what they expected.
Yes.
It always makes your enemy happy when they see what they want to see.
Yeah, so I think we can now jump straight to the action, because it was also kind of unusual action, right? Because I mean, usually when we talk about the carrier battles, the public perception is formed by either the hunt for Bismarck or by the battles in the Pacific, where the aircraft carriers, apart from that one unfortunate accident at Samar, were basically staying kind of behind horizon, out of reach of surface units, out of reach of guns, and were just fully using their long range to strike. But I mean, here the Formidable was right in the battle line, right?
Well, yeah, that once it gets to the night action, but I think it has to be emphasized at this point, the way that the actual night action of Matapan develops is something that you see quite a lot in the Mediterranean, and it's almost unique to the Mediterranean. In the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Arctic, you either have a battle or you don't. The Mediterranean is the only place you actually get even vaguely close to what you might classify as a full fleet engagement with guns. And during the day, you have this back and forth where Italian formations are showing up and firing on British formations. The British formations, which are outgunned by the Italian heavy cruisers, are then falling back. Then British cruisers are backed up by heavier British formations, and then the Italian heavies show up, and so on and so forth. And it's a somewhat unique circumstance in the Mediterranean, largely because the Italians actually, unlike the Germans, actually have a fleet, not a series of small ships and random squadrons. And it's during these actions that Formidable finally manages to get its airstrikes off. And they come in small groups, and they're making their airstrikes. They're joined occasionally on some of the strikes, because there's three main strikes, and they're actually joined by odd swordfish and albacores actually coming off of Crete, which does lead to the rather hilarious instance of, because bearing in mind at this point the Allies are present in Greece, it turns out there's one working aerial torpedo in Greece. Between the British and Greek forces there, they contrive to send this one working aerial torpedo with one of two working swordfish to negotiate its way down from Greece to Crete to refuel, to go after the Italians. The Greeks are so determined to have a crack at the Italians that they basically ship their one working aerial torpedo halfway across the Mediterranean just to have a pop at Vittorio Veneto. And
they still claim that was the torpedo which did the damage.
Yeah,
let's be honest.
Yeah, and but the thing is, again, the Italians actually do pretty well with these attacks. They group themselves up pretty tightly. They've got quite a ferocious air defense. But what happens is that this is bearing in mind all this back and forth cruiser actions, battleship actions, heavy cruisers.
It's a pursuit. It's a pursuit.
Yeah, it's a pursuit, and it's the lead up to the, what we classify as the main Battle of Matapan. And what ends up happening is that although the Italian air defense is working relatively well, as night closes in and it gets darker, now all of a sudden you have an Italian fleet that has next to no night training, which will become very important later on. And they're now trying to fire into the gathering darkness at air targets they can barely see. And the Swordfish pilots have been trained how to operate at night. And it's during this last stage of the air attacks that one of the attacking British torpedo aircraft managed to get the drop on a torpedo that basically hits the Italian cruiser Pola in practically the worst possible place on the ship it could have hit. If it had hit slightly fore or slightly aft, Pola would have still had some power, but it's one of these sort of lucky for some, not so lucky for other shots, in that it basically cripples the entire power grid, and Pola is left without any real means of propulsion. Now, because the Italian admiral doesn't realize just quite how many British warships and what kind of British warships are at sea, when he's asked if they should try and tow Pola back, he agrees. And I mean, Vittorio Veneto is also hit by torpedoes. She gets a torpedo aft, which temporarily stops her, and then they have to try and seal off the damage and work the engines back up to speed. So he's trying to nurse this partly crippled Littorio class battleship home as well. And so he, with the majority of the Italian fleet, takes off with Vittorio Veneto because he realizes that crippled and at night, Veneto's something of a vulnerable target, regardless of what attacks it, whether it's destroyers, cruisers, or battleships. And that ends up leaving Pola waiting for her sister ships and some destroyers to come back and try and rescue her. And this is where we actually get the main night action of Matapan itself starting.
And one thing I'm going to add in here while talking about it on the Swordfish, because you get lots of people talking about Swordfish being obsolete in World War II when they're this obsolete aircraft. And actually, it's something we're discussing today on Bilge Pumps. We're recording it. The thing is, the Swordfish isn't, and actually night attacks are exactly what it was designed for. The reason they chose a biplane, the reason they wanted to be as reliable as possible, the reason all these things were done was so it would be easy enough to fly at night when you didn't have radar, when you didn't have GPS, when you didn't have all the modern navigational aids and night vision aids you have. You had to make the aircraft as stable and as easy to fly and reliable as possible in order for it to be a successful night aircraft in the beginning of the 1930s when they're building it. And that is the thing about the Swordfish. It is a very reliable, rugged aircraft. It's also freaking cold. But actually, there was part of a reason behind that, the British, when they picked that, was they thought, well, you either have to give them a lot of oxygen tanks, and we're going to give them oxygen anyway, but if they're heated and warm, they might go to sleep on a long flight, whereas if they're cold, they're going to keep themselves awake. There are actually people who think that when designing the Swordfish. Open cockpit keeps the crew awake for a long time.
Wasn't that kind of also the logic many navies employed for open bridges?
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean,
maximum view.
One of the other things is that you've got to remember, by the time evening approaches, the Italians are actually left with a rather interesting, if actually, believe it or not, slightly unwarranted view of how exactly the Royal Navy's coming after them, because during the day you've got Blenheim light bombers attacking the fleet from Greece again. You've also
actually
got...
again do the hack here.
Yeah.
The important thing to note here, though, is that Cunningham was actually in direct command of those Blenheims.
Yeah, but
it was one of the world's first. It was, if not the world's first, combined operation led by the actual admiral at the scene. Whereas on the Italian side, it was the exact opposite. The admiral was actually under command from back in Italy. While he had a German liaison officer and a German radio operator on board for the specific purpose of liaising with Air Force, it wasn't to liaise with the aircraft in the area. It was to radio back to Italy to ask the Italian and German air commanders for assistance, which of course slowed the whole process down. And as a result, they hardly saw any air support.
But what's happening during these air attacks is the Blenheim is, relatively speaking, a faster aircraft, and it's attacking from a long way away. And then you've got the relatively slow torpedo bombers coming from the carrier, and you've got fighter cover coming from the carrier as well. But in an almost midway style coincidence, they all happen to show up over the Italian fleet at pretty much the same time. So the Italians get this view that the British have this almost godlike level of coordinating level bombing strikes, torpedo bombing strikes, and fighter strafing strikes all at the same time. Cunningham's trying to do that, but the fact that it actually comes off in that exact coincidence is a complete happy accident. He has no actual ability to command that precise a strike. But this
tradition with the British. We do like our happy accidents in war. They do help us out quite a lot.
But this is
as
why
as the opposite.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why the Italians are withdrawing. Apart from the fact Vittorio Veneto is damaged, is that they're getting this impression that they're actually under a very, very coordinated attack. So they're beginning to think there's a trap, which of course there is. They just think there's a bit more of a trap than there actually is. So we end up with night action. So now Formidable, which has been operating semi-independently, is now vulnerable theoretically to an Italian cruiser or destroyer attack. So it's ordered to fall in line with Warspite and Valiant and Barham. So they're proceeding. Cunningham sends out his destroyers and his cruisers ahead to try and use their radar to pick up where the Italians might have gone, because he knows that Vittorio Veneto has been hit. He doesn't know how badly. He knows the Italian fleet last time they were spotted were moving considerably slower, so he's thinking that there's a possibility we might overhaul them at night, because whilst his fleet is limited to sort of the low 20s of knots, the Italian fleet was last seen moving in the mid-teens, so it's possible.
It's specifically 2 destroyers which he sent out, which I'm going to bring up because they are my favourites to talk about. Mohawk and Nubian, 2 tribal-class destroyers, which are backing up the cruisers. And what's really interesting is Cunningham, when he'd been Rear Admiral destroyers in the Mediterranean, had written a paper saying, we don't need to build tribal destroyers. We shouldn't build them. We shouldn't, so it's a waste of money. And then in World War II, he becomes their biggest advocate, using them at every chance he can get and for every opportunity he can get. So, I just like to add this one in because it's on this occasion, he has all sorts of destroyers to pick from. And he goes, you 2 from one of the flotillas, takes them off the flotilla and surges them forward. And they have 2 jobs. One is to make sure the Italians don't manage to pass between his forward cruisers and his fleet. But the other job is to relay communications from his main fleet to the cruisers, so he doesn't have to use a radio to do it. So he can keep a mission silent so that the Italians don't know where he is.
Which is actually it's a very old school style of communication, right? It's basically what the frigates were doing back in the ship of the line times, making
the entire action is very, very old school, because one area that's often overlooked is, of course, the fact that the British cruiser squadron was fighting for half the day. It was literally doing the old cruiser scout role of maintaining contact with the enemy. When things got a bit too hot, it turned around and ran back towards help. When the opponent was looking as though it was going to try and make an escape, it turned around and charged back into the action. So you had those cruisers being shelled from everything from 15-inch, and 8-inch for most of the day, and occasionally under air attack even, because that they were doing their job as cruisers and that job is the same as from the Age of Sail.
Yeah. And sometimes that air attack was even by enemy aircraft.
And then,
let's be honest, there was a couple of incidents which looked like a rerun of Sheffield and Bismarck scenario going on.
There's a couple of random Junkers 88 showed up for no apparent reason.
Even the Italians didn't really know why they.
No, they knew why they took that. This is the whole thing: is that the admiral was expecting far, far, far more of them, and didn't get them. So
well, this is what I mean. It's like you're supposed to be sending big air support, and then two random Junkers 88s trying to play long range fighter. It's not exactly the world's most overwhelming attack force. But then once we get into the night itself, you actually have, and I know Jamie absolutely hates this term, but you have a great what if.
yes, you do.
Because you've got Orion and the destroyers. So Orion and some of the cruisers are operating as a scout ahead. You've got the destroyers operating as a scout group ahead because Cunningham was trying to spread them out as much as possible. Early on in the night, they spot a large stationary object on radar. And this is, of course, polar. They don't know it's polar, but they spot a large stationary object on radar, so they mark it. They send the information back to the battle fleet, which is following after, and say, right, you might want to check this out on the way. And then they keep motoring along. And about 2.5 hours later, both the destroyers and the British destroyers and the British cruisers, they spot a red light, a masthead light, to the north and northwest of their position. Based on all the available evidence, including the Italian logs, it's near enough certain that's the Italian main body of the fleet, which means that had they pressed just a fraction closer, they could have picked that up on their radar, because bearing in mind, radar allows you to see in the dark, but radar in 1941 is still relatively limited in range. It's better than visual spotting, but it's not horizon to horizon spotting. So they're thinking about, right, we should go and investigate this red light. And if they had investigated that red light, then this very close back to Italian formation with a damaged battleship could have been subjected to a night torpedo attack, followed by obviously summoning Cunningham and the battle fleet. And how that could have gone is a whole other thing, but it didn't happen, because around about the time...
Let's be honest, the torpedo attack would not have been a nice thing for that close-packed organisation.
But while they're contemplating, should we go for this, they notice this big kerfuffle happening to their south, and they think, oh, what's this? And get a bit distracted from the singular red light. And the big kerfuffle that's distracted them is, of course, the main part of the Battle of Matapan that we know about. So you've got Warspite, Valiant, then Formidable in the battle line, and then Barham at the back, and they've got 4 destroyers with them. Valiant has radar, and it picks up the contact that Orion has pointed out to it, which is, of course, polar. And you've got Zara and Fiume coming back the other way, trying to obviously come and help tow polar with a couple of destroyers.
Also have to point out at this stage that Warspite has a secret weapon on board as well, the future Prince Consort.
Yes, Prince Philip. Prince Philip is, I think he's on Valiant, actually.
He's on Valiant.
Was it Valiant? Okay.
Yeah. He's directing the searchlights on Valiant, as Prince Philip Mountbatten at the time. Better known to us as Prince Philip, now Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy. So,
yeah,
and of course, according to some Pacific Islanders, a god. So the Italians didn't really stand much of a chance at this point.
The British at this point have Warspite and Prince Philip. So
and Captain Manly Power. Don't forget him.
And Captain Manly Power. So honestly, if I'd been the Italians, I'd have probably gone, "We're staying home today. Just stay home."
But so you've got Valiant has spotted polar on radar, closing in. The range is dropping, but they spot Zara and Fiume first, because obviously they're mobile, so they kind of unknowingly interpose themselves. And you now have this rather bizarre situation where you've got this tiny little destroyer, HMS Griffin, leading these 4 capital ships, and the range is dropping down. All the guns are pointed at them in the darkness, but the British are operating on a similar kind of principle to that they'd later follow up the North Cape with Scharnhorst, which is, we have you in our gun sights, but we're going to let the range drop and drop and drop and drop, and then the moment we see you so much as twitch, that's when we open fire. And there's this wonderful account from a chap called Lieutenant Alex Dennis, who is in Griffin's fire control on the destroyer ahead. And he switches on his searchlights when it gets down to basically point blank range. We're talking at sort of 3,000 yards ish. He switches on his searchlights. He spots one of the Italian cruisers in his searchlights, fixes them in, and they're at such a close range that the searchlights themselves aren't actually highlighting the entire ship. They're only able to highlight part of it because the beam hasn't got the range to diffuse enough. And so he's like, okay, right, well, we have them in our sights. He gets his little destroyer-grade firing bell, like you might see on, say, the film about the Battle of Cape Matapan. Ting, ting, off goes the firing bell. Griffin's guns open up, little 4-inch or 4.7-inch guns. And this is promptly followed by one of the Italian cruisers disintegrating in an apocalyptic explosion that sends a several hundred-ton twin 8-inch turret pinwheeling through the sky like a Catherine wheel. And poor old Lieutenant Griffin is sitting there going, what did I just do? Having completely forgotten that his signal to fire was also being relayed to, 3 battleships armed with 15-inch guns in the background who have actually done
HMS Formidable with 4.5-inch guns going, hello!
Yes, this is the other fun thing, because they've forgotten to tell Formidable to come out of the battle line.
No, they had said it, but the thing was, because there was a limited amount of signals they could send while keeping it discreet, Formidable had been able to ignore the signals because it was basically there are a limited number of signals we can't send much because it would reveal our position. So Cunningham's trying to go withdraw. You're supposed to be withdrawing, and Formidable's going no. We've got.
I mean that's also something that happens in the Royal Navy from time to time, right? But I think it also demonstrates like the let's say terrible chaos that a night battle is, even for the side that is prepared for the night battle, because that's
but that's why. That's also why she was why she was there. She was there because the last thing you want is your carrier to stumble across cruisers and destroyers without very close fire support. So it's not odd that she's in the firing line. It's the safest place to be in this particular scenario. But of course, the instant the firing line starts firing, you don't want your carrier there, even if it has got 4.5-inch armor plate down the side of its hangar, 3-inch armor flight deck, and 16 4.5-inch guns, all of which are actually designed to be able to shoot across the flight deck, so that you can have a full broadside of 16 4.5-inch guns, if you so desire. But yes, I think this subject is actually a matter of one of the questions, so we'll go into it in greater detail there.
Yes,
yeah. And I would say there's another reason for her to be there as well as that, because this is going to sound strange. The tribals, there is a reason they are easy to detach. There is another reason they're easy to detach for Cunningham, because they're the biggest and fastest destroyers he really has available, despite tribals suffering from turbinitis occasionally, especially if they have been doing at high speed for a long time. They are often used as the bodyguard destroyers for cruisers, for the carriers. And so their job is often to protect the carrier. When she's operating, they will be the ones going off of her. So if they are off doing something else, he either has to give her less capable destroyers, because he has a limited number of destroyers which are less capable of keeping up with her if she wants to make, or he keeps her with the main fleet, and then she's protected by the whole group. So that's the thing. It comes to something when you sort of going, well, you have these escorts which can allow her to operate freely, but that means you can't do something else with those escorts. So if you want to do something else with those escorts, you have to bring Formidable in view. Because, again, if that's... this again comes back to some of the Royal Navy destroyer command, and this is one of the things you get into when you're discussing smaller ships in wartime, and people don't understand quite often how many of these ships have these effects. But if they are on bodyguard duty, as you could call it, for a ship like a carrier, etc., well, they know what their duty is. When it's I sometimes get it wrong. It's Glorious, which comes across Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. And the 2 destroyers then charge Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. They try and put smoke up between them and the carrier, and they charge them. Now, that isn't unusual. That's what Royal Navy destroyer commanders had understood from the interwar period onwards, and was their duty. If your carrier was attacked, you were there to protect the carrier. You did whatever was necessary to try and get the carrier to safety. And if that meant you and your crew were blown to smithereens, that was the cost of doing it.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that is why you had it. But the trouble is, you wanted it, as carriers have got faster, the illustrious class, etc., come in, and this is one of the reasons why the tribal class has been built by the Royal Navy. Once you've got carriers coming which are faster, some of the older destroyers can't keep up with them if they're going at full speed. So you need the bigger destroyers to keep up, which have more horsepower, to keep up with the larger carriers, the faster carriers.
Yeah, it's kind of vicious circle. I mean, it's even the same as with the fast battleships, right? The North Carolina class was designed to be able to keep up with carriers, and then suddenly in battle conditions it cannot because the carrier is still doing 5 knots more on flank speed.
And to emphasize, sorry.
So I just wanted to speed this along a bit because we have questions to attend to, and I mean
you have the bilge pumps on board. You're in trouble.
So
I know.
Let's try and wrap up the actual action itself then quickly. So this night action, it now becomes incredibly chaotic. Even though, as you say, the British have kind of have this planned out, and it's at point blank range. You've got the 4 Italian destroyers. 2 of them, I'm not even going to try and pronounce the first names because my Italian isn't that good. But one of them has the second part of his name is Alfieri, and the other one is Carducci. They are sunk along with Fiume and Zara, but 2 others, Giaberti and Oriani, are damaged, but they actually managed to make it out of there despite the fact that they're caught at such close range with searchlights and everything, and there's radar, so night isn't offering them much cover. They drop smoke, and what the smoke allows them to do is escape the British destroyers, which don't have the radar, because the radar-equipped battleships are focusing on taking out Fiume and Zara. And, of course, you've got Prince Philip there on Valiant directing the searchlights so that everyone knows what to shoot at. But whilst all this is going on, so not only have you got the chaos that lets 2 Italian destroyers escape, you've also got Havoc, one of the British destroyers, is wheeling about the place, almost gets blown out of the water by Warspite, and literally the very last second, Warspite manages to not shoot at it. But having dealt now with that aspect, the mobile aspect of the Italian force present, Barham points out that, we did actually spot Polar a minute before we engaged Zara and Fiume. So Cunningham turns back, brings his battleships up to find the Polar crippled, and he finds that some of his destroyers, in their mad swirl with the Italian destroyers, have already found Polar, and they are legitimately, because of Polar is crippled, they're legitimately circling it like a small pack of sharks, wondering whether or not we can board, take, and tow Polar back home. And Cunningham actually seriously considers this for a while before he realizes that they're now far enough west that come sunrise, if they're towing Polar, they're going to have reduced speed, and that will leave them in range of mass German and Italian airstrikes. So he decides that, unfortunately, they're not going to be able to take Polar as a prize. They get as many of the crew off. I mean, a lot of the crew have already abandoned the ship already, but the crew are basically told, you need to leave. And 2 of the destroyers put torpedoes into Polar. Polar is put down. There's still survivors in the water. And so Cunningham, now realizing dawn is coming, I need to get out of range of the Italian and German bombers. He opens a open radio channel, no encryption, back to...
He actually sends, I think it's a Fulmar to Malta. And the message is broadcast in Malta because he didn't want to
by open channel though. So he sends he has a message relayed to the Italians where he says, look, I've sunk your ships, because there's still survivors from the other 4 ships in the water. He says, I've sunk your ships, they're at this location. You can send a hospital ship out and we're not going to do anything to it, but you need to come and rescue your men ASAP. So an Italian hospital ship comes out and saves a fair number of the sailors that are still left in the water that the British weren't able to recover. The Greeks are very, very disappointed because there's actually a formation of Greek destroyers that have been burning hard from Greece the entire day and night, hoping to get in on the action, and probably would have gotten in on the action had it been with the main Italian fleet, but they're just that little bit too far north to get in on the cruiser action. Before
I'll hack in again the map because you can see the destroyers there. You can see that they were quite off, but well.
They also had this is one of the interesting things about that is one of the commanders of one of the destroyers. His chief engineer wrote basically managed to do a quick scribble of a paper that they flashed across the flagship, and they were basically saying if Valiant took Paola in tow, they reckoned they could get home in time because she could tow it at a high enough speed. But they needed her to tow it. The destroyers weren't powerful enough to move it, and Cunningham didn't want the idea of trying to turn one of his battleships into a tugboat.
But wasn't Paula actually boarded in the event?
Yes.
Oh yeah,
She-
they didn't manage to keep them off that long. These are Royal Navy sailors. There is stuff not bolted down aboard that ship. It is not going to be
Because
left.
I believe especially some of the older VNW class destroyers in the area received some light Italian AA guns that were taken off Paula actually.
If it wasn't bolted down, or if it was bolted down with bolts that portable bolt cutters could sever, it was taken in the finest tradition of Royal Navy boarding parties. That's why there's still substantial parts of Polar around as souvenirs.
Also, at least one destroyer crew did manage to get some cutting gear on their over there with them, because there is again a complaint from one of the officers, and I almost put this in my book, but it didn't go in there in the end because there just wasn't space for it. But there is a complaint from one of the officers that he lost. They used up one of his tanks of cutting gear, liquid oxyacetylene gear, and all he got from it was just a very fancy valve reader thing. I forgot what it is. Gauge.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember the word gauge for some
As a
reason. I do
souvenir.
apologize. As a souvenir, all he got was the gauge. Apparently, the people with the gear got some really cool stuff, but all he got was a gauge. So he was complaining about that.
That's how it
He
goes.
should have gone over there himself, you know.
In any case, I think now it's time to switch to the questions.
Yes.
And I'll start with one that I take for myself because it's easy.
Mhm.
And even I know the answer. So Super Saber 06 is asking, is in the ship list there is a destroyer named HMS Greyhound? There was also a movie released last year starring Tom Hanks called Greyhound. Was there also an American destroyer named Greyhound? So I actually did search just to be sure. The Greyhound in the movie is fictional, but there were 3 ships called USS Greyhound. First was a 1822 schooner, sold in 1824. Then there was a patrol boat between 1917 and 1919. And then there was a troop transport USS Greyhound from 1943 to 1944. So, yeah, no relation to the HMS Greyhound. But now let's go to the more serious questions because well, there is obviously a Blackburn question, but let's get there later.
There is always a Blackburn.
We've got the questions from the Google Doc as well, from the pre-selected ones.
Yeah.
So let's see.
Ooh.
As an Excelsior 2 is asking, as a naval historian, I asked to my colleague Dr. Clark especially, why the Regia Marina at Matapan had little to no support from either Regia Aeronautica or Luftwaffe units, while the Axis intelligence was aware of the presence of an aircraft carrier in the East Mediterranean Sea.
Basically, in answer to that one, it's so we always hear about the fights between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy because they are quite so massive and epic. However, they are by no means the only nation which has its services which would almost be preferred to fighting each other than fighting the Allies or fighting the Axis. In this case, there is the problem that the Admiral has to send a signal, and he has to send 2 signals. He has to get the officer with him. He has to persuade him to send a signal by using their radio up to the air headquarters of both the Germans and the Regia both Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, and then they have to send their signals down. And at any point to the way, the officers in there could say, "Oh no," and not be sure and all that stuff. But he also, to make sure it gets done, has to send a signal up to his own, the Regia Marina headquarters up in Rome, and get them to back him up. And they sometimes actually have to go up to Il Duce, who is well known for being really, really lazy and really difficult to get hold of, because he always has better things in the afternoon, like cheese to eat and wine to drink, and many, many secretaries to chase around the offices. He's really not a nice guy, Il Duce. And sometimes they have to go right up to him to get him to order the Regia Aeronautica to actually do something. And even then, what they do will not always be great. But also, you have to remember that the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe are also at the end of their logistics down in the south. They've got limited logistics. This is half the trouble for the Italians the whole way through World War II. They have limited fuel and they have very difficult logistics because the British do their best to interrupt it and to intercept and to cause it trouble. And then there's the fact that the Germans are not really interested in supplying it. And, you know, for them, it's always a bit of a secondary theatre.
There's also, of course, an awful lot of testosterone involved. So, just as an example, Field Marshal Kesselring wrote his opinion of the Italian forces, and basically he called the Italian fleet as being of doubtful seaworthiness. He thought it was a fair weather fleet, and he also considered that their requests for air support imposed ridiculous demands on the Luftwaffe. So you're up against that kind of attitude as well. But on top of that, though, the Italian force was not stupid. They went to sea believing they had a plan for air support. They went to sea with reassurances that the Luftwaffe would provide the best long-range fighter cover they could, which was the bomber versions of the Ju-88. And they went to sea thinking that there would be roaming groups of anti-ship bombers and patrol aircraft. Now, they did appear, but they appeared in penny packets, and they appeared at a far more reduced rate than had actually been promised. So, it was mentioned. Drac mentioned that a flight of, I think it was about 4 fighter Ju-88s did actually appear, and that did actually attempt to engage the Formidable's albacores. But Formidable had sent up a couple of Fulmar fleet fighters to cover those albacores, and the Fulmars did a head-on engagement with those Ju-88s and managed to down a couple of them. So it wasn't naturally, when you're sitting on board a ship, you don't see this happening. So you're also getting something of a gripe from the Italian admiral, because these kinds of incidents, and also Formidable was faced a torpedo attack and various bombing attacks while it was heading away from the main British fleet from time to time while it was trying to launch and recover aircraft. But these things weren't noticed by the Italian admiral, so it all built up that whole tension that you always get, just like you see in chat in World of Warships. What were you guys doing? Sitting up the back, hugging the line. Same sort of thing is going on here.
Yeah, and you've also got to remember that the daylight action is happening much further east. The reason Cunningham is worried about the majority of Regia Aeronautica and Luftwaffe air support is because by the time they've actually caught up to Fiume, Zara and Pola, the action has spent most of the afternoon and most of the evening and a good part of the early morning sailing at fairly high speeds west. So most of the time when you could have had the bulk of like Ju-87s and such coming after the British is at night when they can't operate. During the day, when the action is much, much further east, it's more, as Jamie's just covered, it's more in the realm of twin-engined aircraft that have a longer range, but there's much fewer of them. And obviously, the further out you go, the harder it is to actually find anything, because exponentially more sea area to search.
And you have to remember again, this goes back to, and we're talking about the Italian ability to fight at night and these sort of things. You go back to the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy have been planning to fight at night basically since the Battle of Jutland, and Beatty and had managed to muck it up for Jellicoe, and the Royal Navy had to let the High Seas Fleet got away during the night. Since that point, the Royal Navy's been utterly committed to fighting at night. No one else is ever going to escape them again at night. And this has driven quite a lot of their planning for operations in the 1920s and 30s and preparing for World War II. And as we said earlier, it's why the Swordfish looks like it does, why the Fulmar is a two-seater as well, is so it can do night operations, so it can do long-range reconnaissance, so it can have a navigator in its back. This is a fleet which has been set up for night operations. And these aircraft, as we often talk about, you often hear the Fulmar being put down, or you hear the Swordfish being put down. They are capable of night flying. The far more modern aircraft, which people will talk about from the German perspective, the Ju-87 and all these things, they're not. They don't have night crews. And this is the point. It's not just training and doctrine. It's also, when you're developing your doctrine and your training, you have to start thinking, how do we make equipment which is going to be able to operate in this? And for the Axis, in many ways, it's quite a shock when they're facing the British equipment at the beginning of World War II, and the British are able to do what they're able to do at night, because they're going, but you're the British. This isn't possible. You have your equipment. It looks on paper, it's so terrible. And British are going, you didn't know.
I think this actually concerns or touches another question we had from Ariavel. Why did the Regia Marina not have any doctrine for night fighting by the time of Matapan, given this was several months on from the Royal Navy demonstrating they had capacity to conduct night attacks from their carrier rate on Taranto? They surely understood that night action was a possibility. Well, I would say that basically the main problem is that you don't really get a doctrine within a few months. I mean, you can come up with some sort of doctrine, but you cannot in such a short time train your crews to to use it and modify your equipment to actually enable it. I mean, if we take, for example, in the Pacific, the Japanese doctrine staff groups actually had come up with several variants of how to change the carrier doctrine already before Midway, like how to do such sacrilegious things like use battleships to soak up damage and protect carriers and stuff like that. But basically, when you are out there fighting a war, you don't have time to change this, because you would have to pull the ships for a long time off the line to get them trained, to get them synced up. At the same time, you would have to burn valuable fuel while doing so, because you, okay, doctrine on paper is nice, but you have to try it out there live. So, I mean, it cannot come just within a few months. That's
no, and
remember the British are doing this, but they've been practicing it for 20 years by this point.
Yeah, and the other thing you've got to remember is that a part trained or half trained crew that thinks it can do night action is actually even more dangerous than a crew that thinks it can't. Because as we saw, even though the British have had all this training for night action, Warspite almost blows a friendly destroyer out of the water in the confusion of the night action. And that's with Warspite's crew having been trained for years in how to do this kind of engagement. If you quickly patch together some kind of night doctrine and somehow manage to get it into the heads of a few of your crews in a few months, you're actually more likely to end up blowing up your own ships, because the crew will have just enough knowledge to think they know how to fight night action, but not enough knowledge to think calmly and rationally and start picking out and identifying targets. So they're going to see a ship and they're going to think, right, night action ship, target, fire. And it turns out you've actually shot one of your own, because they're closer to you. They're going to be easier to see.
And also, I mean, the Italians wanted night fighting capability, but politics. They were working on their own type of radar already at this point, but it wasn't very high on their priority list. Or at least it wasn't very high on the priority list of the powers that were. So the fleet, that the Italian naval doctrine was designed to focus on its strengths. So this is why the Italians had such fast ships, so they could dash out quickly during daylight and achieve what they wanted to do and get back again in a timely manner. So this is why they had such swift and, I suppose, in some ways lightly built ships, because that's what their way of doing war was.
It's also why they have so many visual range finders, so they can try and get the range of their enemy as quickly and as accurately as they can. And as Drac will often it goes on about, if it hadn't been for their poor quality control in terms of their shell manufacture, they would have been very, very deadly in daytime fighting. And actually, it's going to sound strange, but one of the reasons why the British start to focus on night fighting in the late 20s and especially the 30s, and they're doing exercise and they're doing all these things consistently, is because they are presuming they're going to end up fighting a war against the Japanese, possibly against the Italians, and possibly the Germans later on at roughly the same time or close to each other. So they might not have sufficient numbers in that area to fight them. And they notice how many rangefinders are on the Italians to prepare to fight today. So that's one of the reasons why they have the Mediterranean fleet, especially, to emphasize night fighting, so that it can fight them at night when that will nullify that advantage of the Italians, because they won't be able to proceed as at high speed, because they might not notice an obstacle in the water and might end up bashing into something, and their rangefinders won't enable them. And this is pre the British even getting radar. You have to remember, the British have been developing night fighting long before they have radar, and it actually takes a while to work out how to fit radar into their night fighting doctrine.
Yes.
You don't just go, we have radar, yes, that gives us a night fighting doctrine. We had a night fighting doctrine, and then we had to go, hang on, how do we use radar?
Actually, that's again similar to the Pacific, similar to the Japanese, because they also were basically for similar reasons, kind of extensively training for night actions, for the decisive battle, and also like were so special. I would say they maybe went a bit too overboard and got over specialized in that manner, but they also were actually in most of the battles around Guadalcanal, even where radar was involved, it was the Japanese lookouts who spotted the enemy first. Because simply radar back in that time wasn't like a magic all-seeing eye, but like, okay, you see this little squiggle on the oscilloscope. Is that an enemy? Is that an island? Is that rain? Is that a flock of birds? Is that just something happening with the machine? So yeah, that's. And that ties down with another question from Wolf's Wet Paws. Did the Italians introduce radar to the ships after this battle and before the end of World War II? I have to admit, I don't know.
Sorry, the GUFO radar system, or GUFO, I presume that's how it's pronounced. I think it's actually an acronym, but never mind. As Jamie mentioned earlier, they did have this radar system under development pre-war. It was paused, and then the Vietnam Matapan, amongst various actions, kind of reminded them that maybe this was actually a good idea. We should restart development on it. There were various ships that were later equipped with the GUFO radar, and some subvariants of various radar equipment. But you've got to remember, one, the Italians are out of the war a little bit earlier than most others, and two, not all radars are created equal. You've got the easiest and most basic radar to build and to mount on a ship is an air search radar, and then some air search radars can be used in a surface search mode, but only at much closer ranges, and they're not precisely designed to do that. Then you can try and build a surface search radar. And once you've got air search and surface search radar, you can try and start to expand the range. And this is one of the things that you have at Matapan, even on the British side, although they're considerably ahead on the radar. the radar doesn't actually have in surface search mode the acquisition range of a visual spotter during the day. So it's useful at night because it can see further than a visual spotter can at night, but it can't see as far as a visual spotter could during the day. So you're still relying on a mixture of visual and radar spotting. You're using your visual spotters to see tiny clues like that red light, for example, and then you close in on that. They can't see you. You can't really see much else of them, and then the radar shows you what's there when hopefully that you can't see, that they can't see you coming the other way. So yeah, the Italians do have ships with radar equipped by the end of their involvement in World War II, but it's very few, and by that point they're effectively installing what you might call first-gen radars at a time when everyone else has moved on to second or third gen.
And that's
just
another
to
reason why you
stress,
have Formidable with the fleet, because remember, she's one of the ships which has the best radar fits of any ship in the force.
I think there's only about 3 or 4 ships in the British fleet force at Matapan that actually were fitted with radar. So Formidable,
Valiant,
and one of the cruisers, I think, or 1 or 2 of the cruisers.
Yeah,
so
Orion.
it's because at this point of the war, again, the British, yes, had been mass producing radar sets, but they were sitting in harbour because they didn't have enough cruisers to spare a cruiser being pulled out of the battle line to fit the radar to the ship because it was needed at sea. So they would basically only get fitted with radar after they'd been battle damaged and were needing to be repaired anyway. So there's always a swings and roundabouts for all these things. It's not just a matter of climbing up the mast, bolting it on, and plugging in a USB port. It was you had to rewire so much of the ship, and a lot of these ships didn't have an awful lot of electricity floating around.
You had to fit diesel generators to most ships to supply it, and once you started having radars which would turn round as well, that's all sorts of extra work goes into that.
You need to basically rebuild the masts, and
you have to have new masts, and then of course you have to start building a CIC or some form of control center, and you have to basically adapt the direct-to-fire control centers on the cruisers, where they had their fire control computers, into an early version of a CIC with a radar plot, and eventually they get the PPI plot, which is the lovely circular the circular plot you always see on television programs when they're looking at the radar, and it's the line of the radar is going round in a 360, and you see a beep and a beep, in a position. That you eventually get that, but that's only comes in late 1943, 1944, and most of the early radars, especially the ones which had to be hand cranked round or were almost sort of manually positioned or hydraulically turned, they couldn't be fitted with it. Radar is not something which comes in and whoom, I've got great radar. That's amazing. It solves all my problems. You've got the first gen radar, which is frankly. Okay, it works. That's good.
It's actually I've seen some time ago like a gunnery manual for the American 5-inch gun, which was specifically dealing with the radar fire control, and they had some images of the old pre-PPI radar plots. So basically you have 2 oscilloscopes, and you have to get your information from that, and that sounded utterly crazy. But not all radars are equal. I mean, let's just take Germans, right? They went into the naval radar with the idea of getting a very good rangefinder, and they got a very good rangefinder, but that radar was not really usable for search and not usable for fire control. So at least in the first iterations, all it can do is get you very accurate range to target. And that's basically it.
Just as importantly is how do you integrate that radar into your operations. So by this stage of the war, Formidable was already using rudimentary fighter plotting, fighter control to provide the best intercept course for its handful of fighters. It didn't have a lot of them, so it used them as best they could by developing radar plots. radar fighter direction. Now, by the time the Royal Navy and the US Navy start working together in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, the US Navy had plenty of good air search radars, but hadn't integrated it into any form of fighter control system. So there was an awful lot of very high priority, shall we say, documentation being exchanged and staff being exchanged and liaison officers being exchanged in order for the US Navy to absorb as much of that at sea experience that the Royal Navy had produced. That USS Robin, the story of HMS Victorious joining USS Saratoga in the Solomons, was, that was one of the big things to come out of it behind the scenes, was that Victorious had all of her Avenger aircraft taken off her and put on Saratoga, and most of Saratoga's Wildcat fighters put on Victorious, so that Victorious could be the fighter defense carrier, because it had a fully worked up communications and air directions crew that could maximize their use.
And once radar gets upgraded as well, it's not just like a computer game where you just research new radar instantly, all your ships have new radar. These radars have to be produced and they have to be physically installed. So even by something as late in the war as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, at the Battle of Surigao Strait, where you have the 6 US battleships taking out 1 Japanese ship, half the US battleships have the latest and greatest radar that America can produce, and they're the ones that do 95% of the damage. And you've got the other 3 which have radar, but they've got an older version of it that isn't as long range, isn't as fine detail, and can't actually provide them with the accurate levels of fire control. So although all 6 battleships are radar equipped, only 3 of them actually get any substantial engagement off.
And one of them doesn't fire at all.
Yeah, exactly. So just having radar it's not like a binary on-off switch of capability. There's graduations to it.
Yeah. Since we touched the fighter control, I actually did read again somewhere that basically one of the reasons the Royal Navy had developed quite early the fighter control system was that it all came up in the North Sea, where actually with the Gloucester Gladiators and even Blackburn Skua, they had basically one shot at intercepting, for example, Heinkel 111 because it was faster than the fighters. So like you have to get the intercept good on the first try, or you don't have a chance to repeat it. Is that?
Don't even mention the Blackburn Rock, please. Just no one talk about the Blackburn Rock.
I mean,
but leaving that to one side, yes, it was. Yeah,
this is one of the major problems that you have in the 1930s, especially in the latter part of the 1930s, in the aircraft are getting fast enough that previously the theory of fighter defense on carriers had been our outlying pickets, destroyers or cruisers will see the air attack, they'll tell us, we'll send fighters off, and the fighters will climb to altitude, intercept the attack before it hits home, everything's happy. But by the latter part of the 1930s, attack aircraft have gotten to a speed that even if you've got an open line to a picket destroyer and it tells you the minute they spot these aircraft on the horizon, those aircraft will be overhead and bombing you or torpedoing you long before your fighters have gotten off the deck and gotten to any kind of usable altitude where they can do an intercept. And this is one of the reasons. I mean, this is one of the reasons actually that the British decided to go after armored flight decks instead, because they think there's a fairly good chance they are going to get hit. Then radar comes in. And they're able to start thinking about detecting further out, getting fighters up further out. But then if they're further out, it's going to be a much wider vector. So you've now got to think about vectoring them in and establishing fighter control. And this kind of all actually ends up coming together off of Norway, where you have the land-based Luftwaffe strike aircraft coming in. And yeah, the RAF is there with skewers and rocks. The Fleet Air Arm is there with skewers and rocks. And they're basically forced by circumstance to take all these disparate elements of things they were thinking about in the late 30s and put them together into a coherent or semi-coherent form of fighter direction, effectively, because it's that or die.
It's a classic. It's a classic example of innovation starting from the bottom up. So what you had in September 1939 was Ark Royal which didn't have radar, in company with a cruiser or two that did have radar. So one of the radio operators in the room aboard Ark Royal used his own initiative, thinking, well, I've got this portable map board in front of me. I'll get the picket cruiser to relay via flag its radar detections. I can do a quick little mathematical calculation as to where my skewers are or my at any particular time, and then radio to that skewer pilot the best intercept course, because the skewer pilot can't see them. It just knows that there's something happening. And so this radio operator started the whole process, and within about a year had been promoted to the point where he was now on a shore base back in England, training everybody he can as fast as he can on how to, and also developing fighter direction techniques.
And it's also, the British aren't starting from scratch even in 1939, because, and this is going to pain me to say this, one of the reasons behind the Blackburn's development and deployment, believe it or not, is a version of airborne early warning control. And it goes back to the visual thing. Their purpose of, they were supposed to be up there spotting for the battleships from the carriers, but also spotting enemy air attacks coming in, radio back to the carrier, and so the carrier could launch fighters.
Yes.
I do not believe I just said something good about the Blackburn voluntary.
But I mean, this...
I need to hold myself now for a few minutes.
But I mean, this also demonstrates the thing we were talking about earlier with the development of any sort of doctrine. It takes time, and even this, you just said it, it took basically 1 year before the training course could be established in large enough capacities. So that unfortunately means that often when you are in the middle of war, you are always on the back footing in some aspect.
And the advantage the Royal Navy had was they were far bigger and they had far more fuel than the Regia Marina. The Royal Navy at no point in World War II is going, we're running short of fuel, shall we cut training short? No.
And they also
they have huge fuel storage dumps all around the world. They are keeping their things going.
Yeah, and they also had kind of sort of their own planes, unlike the Regia Marina. So that also helps.
They
that
managed to
you
get
have
them
something
back in
to
about 1939.
Yeah.
We have the award was in 1937. They got them back in 1939. It had been 20 years of fun.
We have a question from Dry Alga from the pre-set questions. Whether the Royal Navy wasn't afraid of sending HMS Warspite, and I expect by extension the other World War I famed battleships against modern battleships such as the Vittorio Veneto.
Why they weren't scared?
Whether they weren't concerned.
Whether they were. They were somewhat concerned, because they knew that the Littorios were faster, so it was a case of if things started to go wrong, there wasn't really going to be much escape. But it was a combination of, one, we don't have a choice because the Royal Navy has a very limited number of fast battleships, especially in 1941. Your choices of fast battleships are King George V, Hood, arguably, and depending on what time period in 1941 you're talking about, Prince of Wales. And they've got to worry about the Germans. At this point, the Germans still have both Scharnhorsts. They're obviously about to get, in early 41, they're about to get Bismarck online, and in the latter part of 41, Tirpitz is beginning to come online. And whilst the Kriegsmarine as a whole is less of a threat than the Regia Marina in terms of sheer numbers of modern warships, the difference is that the Kriegsmarine, if it's not contained, can get out into the Atlantic shipping lanes, and that is the existential threat to the British. Whereas the Regia Marina, whilst losing control of North Africa would be very annoying and very bad on a strategic level. Losing control of the Mediterranean would be even worse on a strategic level. That is a situation that could be recovered from as long as Gibraltar can be held and as long as at least the other end of the Suez Canal can be held. Whereas Britain being knocked out of the war is not really a recoverable situation for Britain to do on its own. And so this very limited amount of fast capital ships that are available have to be retained in the UK for use potentially against German fast capital ships breaking out. Renown spends a lot of time in Force H at the other end of the Mediterranean, but it is only a battle cruiser. So the British
Although don't tell Sean Orson Nice now that because they ran from her. So she's a battleship as far as they're concerned.
But the Royal Navy is not under any illusions that Renown would be at a significant disadvantage if it fights a Littorio, at least on paper. I mean, if the Littorio's got a good batch of shells, then yeah, very definitely Renown's at a disadvantage. To be honest, if Renown's fighting a Littorio with a bad batch of shells, then Renown's probably the safest place to be on the planet. But they don't know that, and they can't assume that's going to be the case for every engagement. So they have to look at what have we got that's kind of next down the line. We want at least one Nelson class to remain in the Atlantic because although it's slower, it's still the heaviest hitting battleship we've got. Nelson spends some time in the Western Mediterranean until an Italian torpedo bomber blows up the cheese store, amongst other things, with a torpedo, which is very annoying. And then the next...
Who knew the Italians hated cheese so much? I'd have thought for a nation which loved mozzarella, they wouldn't want to destroy it.
But the next things down that list are your Queen Elizabeth class. And that's what the Royal Navy sends. They send the best that they've got, which is the modernized Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant. They back it up with points with Barham, Malaya, some of the R's to make up the numbers. And yeah, to an extent, they're a little bit worried about having to take on one or two Littorios, but that's why they send in the numbers. They're not so worried about taking on Caio Duilio or Giulio Cesare. They're fairly confident that even an R they think is probably more than a match for them. But that's why the Mediterranean fleet has 3 or 4 more battleships at any given time. Plus, they keep feeding carriers into the Mediterranean, despite a lot of them either getting sunk like Eagle and Ark Royal or getting badly damaged like practically every armored carrier, because they know that a combination of superior numbers of battleships and at least one or more carriers should give them a advantage if they have to fight something that's as big and nasty an opponent as a Littorio. So it's kind of they're aware of the dangers, but they are taking steps to mitigate it.
What was actually the reaction of the Royal Navy after the Valiant and Queen Elizabeth have been mined in Alexandria? Because that's probably an operation that many people don't know about, but the Italian naval special units managed to actually sink 2 battleships.
They're very worried about it. I mean,
their reaction was to prevent anyone from actually realizing it.
Yeah. They go through this whole massive deception plan to make it look like Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are still perfectly serviceable, because again, they're not underestimating the Italian Navy. They are 99% certain that if the Italians get so much as a whiff that Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are out of service, the Italians will sortie into the Eastern Mediterranean in strength. Whether or not they would, I mean, some of the Italian admirals certainly would. Whether or not Iachino in particular, who seems to have been scared completely stiff by Matapan, would have done so is another matter. But some of the other Italian admirals definitely would have gone for it, and that would have been an utter disaster for the Navy. So the sort of every night at that point, Cunningham's going to bed, and the last thing in his prayers is, "Oh, and please don't let the Italians work out what we've done with Queen Elizabeth and Valiant."
Because they are pretty much propping them up. They are keeping them. They're making them look as valiant. They are appropriate enough for Valiant. They're making her look as valiant and vital as possible.
Yeah, actually, as far as I know, Durant de la Pen, who actually did lead the team that sabotaged Valiant, got a medal for that action from the hands of former Valiant's captains after the war.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing. The Royal, often goes very underappreciated about World War II in the naval aspect is the Italian Navy was a very highly respected and very capable opponent, and the Royal Navy knew and acknowledged that. You don't put the amount of resources the Royal Navy put into the Mediterranean if they're an easy rollover. I'm personally of the opinion. Sorry,
it's okay. I was interrupting.
I'm personally of the opinion, and I think from what I've read, a lot of the Royal Navy evaluations were as well, that the further away you separated the Italian ships and Italian officers from the Italian admirals, the better they did. Most of their really highly successful operations are either attacks like the one on Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, the continuing operations they have in Gibraltar, where they managed to basically pull off the same trick repeatedly against merchant shipping, and no one has any clue what they're doing until after the Italian armistice is signed, when they kind of pop up and say, hello, we were based over here in this wreck that you never bothered to check out. A lot of the Italian destroyer and cruiser actions, although some of them don't cover themselves too much in glory, like the pair that HMAS Sydney hunts down, but a lot of the other Italian light ship actions are very well commanded. A lot of their cruisers are very well commanded and very well led. I mean, even with Matapan, it takes an awful lot of courage to turn around to your admiral and say, right, I'm going to take these 2 heavy cruisers off into the night, theoretically towards an enemy that may be coming our way, knowing that you have absolutely no way to actually fight at night. I mean, okay, it didn't work out very well for them, but the fact they even attempted it is a mark in their credit. It's usually when it comes to Italian, what you might call Italian naval failures, it's almost always traceable to a handful of high-ranking admirals, most of whom, to be fair, have been appointed because they're more loyal to the fascist Italy under Mussolini than any particular reflection on their competence. And it's the admirals that tend to run scared and either massively over or massively underestimate what's going on. And you actually see the Italian Navy improving as the war goes on, as various of the admirals, when they fail, get moved out of active positions, and they're just under a little bit of it's a little bit unfortunate for the Italian Navy that someone like Bergamini, who's actually very good at what he does, ends up in charge of the Italian Navy just at the point where he can't physically actually do anything. But even then, when you think about the amount of force the Allies were bringing to bear in Operation Husky, Bergamini was there ready to go with everything the Italian Navy had afloat to go into a massive do-or-die full-on battle line assault on the landing forces. Again, that's not an action of a cowardly Navy. Unfortunately, obviously, Bergamini was on Roma when it got Fritz X'd on its way to Malta, and the operation to go after Operation Husky, probably for everyone concerned, got cancelled because of the armistice. But the Italian Navy is a good Navy. It's just hampered, unfortunately, by a few political appointees up top.
Admiral Cunningham, actually wrote about this very shortly before the war. The Royal Navy would often visit port visits and have a chat and have a glass of wine with their counterparts in the Italian Navy, and he writes that his chats with the various admirals that he knew revealed pretty much a bit of a civil war going on within the Italian Navy, because you had the old school commanders who had come up through the system, who were basically there to be professional officers, and then you had a whole new rank of appointees, fascists put there by Mussolini and his cronies. And the difference in quality between the two was, shall we say, obvious, in terms of just the Cunningham reports how some of them were just foul-mouthed and abusive and rude. This is before the war, and others were pristinely competent and courteous and understanding. And he even recounts one story where he was talking to an admiral, an Italian admiral, who told him, well, we have to be very, very careful about what we say, because even our gym instructors are appointed by the fascists, i.e. spying on the admirals and reporting back their chats that they had while they were doing their PT training. So it was not it was not a conducive environment for any form of shall we say free thinking.
And also, there is the classic story that comes out from Cunningham, and I'm never quite sure if this is a myth or if this is a reality. I think it's a bit of both. I think it's been sort of blown up in time. But he recounts being taken into one officer's bedroom aboard his ship. Is the flagship he's on, being entertained, and this admiral goes, "Oh, follow me, come on, there's something I need to show you." Gets taken in, and he's a typical British gentleman who's been taken into another of the period, taken into another an admiral's bedroom. It's sort of a case of, why are you taking me in here? Do you have particularly good scotch? If so, please open it up. And the reason he's taken him in is because this admiral has a copy of the most recent publication of the life of Nelson on his bedside table. And Cunningham goes, "Oh yes, that's lovely. Yes, and mentally he's thinking, what are you? Because yes, you are supposed to be a historian. Actually, if you consider the admirals, one of the interesting things today is modern generals and admirals, and are suddenly starting to go, yes, here's a reading list. Yes, go study history. That's actually a good idea to do. In the 1920s and 30s, it was de rigueur. They studied history. There are a number of admirals who retire and become historians, like Bacon and Richmond, are enormous. They become very respected historians. It's very much a part of it, and they know this stuff. They don't have to. He wouldn't have a book on his nightstand because that would be absurd. He wouldn't be keeping a book away from his staff or in his nightstand or in there as a special book. If he read, when Cunningham finished the book, he used to chuck it quite literally at a staff member who he thought should read it. This is one of the things which doesn't get around about Cunningham, because he's always this very nice, very appropriate man. But he used to often use history books as ways to remind people to study and learn. So a few staff officers did get binged over the years by history books. But this is the sort of the thing. This is the difference. Whereas he also recounts another story with another Italian admiral where he actually discussed over dinner the life of Collingwood and what Collingwood got up to, i.e. Nelson's second in command. And that was that he recounts as being a lovely meal, a lovely interaction, a lovely discussion. So that's your sort of thing. You've got the professionals who will talk, who really know stuff, who will discuss this over dinner, and then you've got the ones who are really not, who basically are showing off. Look, I've got Nelson by my bedside table. That doesn't make you a good admiral, having a copy of Nelson's life history by your bedside table.
First, you actually have to read it
and understand it, and then realize what Nelson got wrong as well as he got right.
Yes.
Yeah, there was also a comment now lost in the mists of the chat on YouTube. Actually, that the battle was very one-sided, but I mean it became very one-sided in the night phase for the reasons that we've discussed. But if you look at the daylight action, I mean, yes, the Italian Navy didn't really deal damage, but it wasn't really a one-sided affair, because the British cruisers were not exactly in the safe position, and basically what told in the end were mostly the airstrikes, because that's
very one-sided against the British cruisers.
Yeah, because
Go, Drake.
I was going to say the basic the day action is British cruisers spot smoke. They go to investigate. They find the Italian heavy cruisers. They do a quick 180 because the Italian heavy cruisers are quite happy to open fire at considerable long range, and the British cruisers are withdrawing. Then Vittorio Veneto shows up over the horizon, and things get even worse. Saved only again by the fact that the shell spread is sort of postcode area size rather than anything else. But you have reflections from one of the Royal Navy captains who's on board one of the one of the cruisers that's making its escape under smoke. And he's basically looking at it going, well, currently, the flag officer in this cruiser squadron's on this ship. And when that explodes, it's going to be this ship. And when that explodes, it's going to be that ship. And then it's going to be me. And let's not think any further about what's going to happen to me. So he's perfectly cognizant of exactly how this should be going, given that they're a bunch of 6-inch gun cruisers under fire from 8-inch and 15-inch shells. And they're quite relieved and quite grateful when they come out the other side of it, finding that actually no one has exploded. That's partly because they have managed to draw even further out of range. The smoke has started to become effective, but also because the first of Formidable's air attacks have started, and that has proved somewhat distracting for the Italians. But yeah, that early part of the engagement, there was every chance that, at least even with Italian shell quality control issues, at least a stray shell would have quite easily crippled or destroyed one of the British cruisers, and the British didn't have that many cruisers to start with.
Yes, I mean, when you are talking about 15-inch shells versus a light cruiser, the shell doesn't need to explode. Like, as long as it doesn't shatter, even if it just makes a big hole and comes through the other side, it is bound to break something along the way. So, like, and it was kind of a game of Russian roulette, right? Because it was fairly long-range engagement, and even at the best occasions, the hit ratio was in single-digit %. So, like,
they use every single trick in the book. They used every single trick.
Yeah.
You know, the whole changing course by 2 or 3 degrees every minute or so, changing course towards the last inaccurate fall of shots, so that you're adding your course change to the correction being made by the Italian gunner. It was, it by no means was it just luck, but luck had a very, very, very high impact in this scenario. There's no doubt that if the Italians had a better quality shells, that there would have been a lot of smoking, burning British ships on that on sea that day.
Yeah, and you see some of the pictures from.
Sorry.
You can tell how worried Cunningham is, because he actually at one point has Warspite damages herself going out of harbour. So she's slow. She's not able to do her full speed, and of course Barham is not as fast.
Ship in the Royal Navy.
And so he actually orders Valiant to spool up and go faster, and that's also another reason why it's another reason why the 2 tribals are deployed forward to try and sort of be they keep why he's trying to keep ships between him and the cruisers, and why he's got them doing what they're doing, is because he's trying to control this battle, because he knows how much trouble is going on, how much risk is there. He's trying to get there. And for Cunningham to order Valiant to go away and leave him is something that you have to understand. For Cunningham, that's a big wrench.
Yes.
At one point, Cunningham is considering transferring his flag to Valiant. He only doesn't because he thinks that would slow down Valiant in trying to get to the cruisers, because Cunningham wants to get to where his cruisers are. This is the thing. You can sometimes tell Cunningham's career as a destroyer officer. He is very keen to be wherever the fighting is, preferably directing it with very large guns, but he'll take torpedoes or anything else he can get hold of.
That's
the reason he doesn't move from Warspite to Valiant is not just because of the time, but also because Warspite has a lot more radios on her than Valiant does. So for him to try and control aircraft and do that things, actually Warspite is better set up than Valiant would be. Valiant has the radar. This is part of the communications bit and the things. But Warspite, because it was the flagship, got the radios fitted. So, this is the part of the things that are going on, part of the technological upgrades. It's not just radar, it's radios, it's all the communications, it's all the control equipment. World War II is one of those wars where the technological balance and what is the really high-tech piece of equipment you need can change week to week, let alone month to month.
Yeah, and Formidable's throwing everything it can at supporting the cruisers, to the point that when you actually get the attack that hits Vittorio Veneto, we hear two and a half years down the line of fighters in the Pacific War strafing enemy decks to suppress anti-air assaults. But in 1941, the Fulmars are flying around strafing the Italian destroyers to suppress their anti-aircraft fire, to allow the Albacores and the Swordfish to press home their attack. And as we've said, the Fulmar is a somewhat underrated aircraft and very often gets unfairly denigrated. But at the end of the day, it is a fairly large, not especially maneuverable aircraft armed with a bunch of 303 machine guns. So given that it's a fighter and a large and somewhat clumsy fighter, for that, it speaks to something of just how determined, desperate the Fleet Air Arm was to get the Italians to stop chasing the British cruisers, that the Fulmars were going in and hosing down destroyers with rifle caliber ammunition just in an attempt to distract them.
They also actually went up against the Veneto itself. I've just done a video where the pilot of one of those Fulmars recounts having met one of the gunnery officers aboard the Veneto after the war, and they had a bit of a chat about how effective the strafing attacks were. Naturally, being 303s, not very, but he jokingly says that we did actually cause them to duck their heads a little. So it's with these. This is what they were doing. They were formidable. Cunningham initially didn't want Formidable to launch aircraft. He wanted to keep everything. He wanted to keep a big alpha strike in reserve, ready to go once he had made contact with the enemy with his battle fleet. That was his initial plan. Things naturally never go to plan. First up, he had his cruisers in dire straits, and he had to somehow divert attention there. Secondly, the Italian force had turned around and started heading away from him instead of towards him. So it's the same situation, or a similar situation to what had evolved in the chase of the Bismarck. You have to slow them down so that you can force a fight. So what was going to be a massive alpha strike ends up turning into 4 separate strikes by Formidable, who is also having to run reconnaissance flights plus cap flights. So that flight deck was extremely busy that day, and some of those pilots flew 3 times. Some of them flew 3 times that day. They were up since before dawn, and they were down after dark. So the role that Formidable played in that battle is seriously underlooked, under-examined.
You're talking about, I think one of the statistics I have read, and I'm not quite sure about this because this was compiled after the war from accounts. One of them is that she managed to get roughly 110 sorties of her aircraft that day. I don't think that's quite true. But
she started the day with 37 aircraft on board.
Yeah.
So that would be possible.
Because,
as I say, if you only look at the strike groups, it doesn't add up. But if you look at the fact that she's also running CAP plus anti-submarine patrol and surface search patrol, then it could start getting into that ballpark.
Yeah. And that's a lot. If you consider, you can, there are modern carriers which cannot match that number of sorties with their air groups. That's the scare. That's something to think about.
I'd quickly switch to another question from MDigidoc. How common was the British signaling of their intentions to increase rescue efforts to the Italians? Did anyone else do something similar in other naval battles in World War II? Well, I believe there were instances basically from most sides, including a few cases with German submarines signaling the presence of survivors in the water, but I guess you know more about this.
It was not common, but it was not rare either. Generally speaking, this is one of the things of in naval combat. If one side sinks the other, under most circumstances, pretty much the minute the firing stops and people start hitting the water, the person who's just doing their level best to sink them is usually right there trying to fish them out of the water, because they may have been enemies up until the point that that ship's stopped being an effective fighting unit, but once that occurs, the sea is the common enemy of all sailors. The only exception really to that being the Japanese Navy, who had a distressing habit of either machine gunning people in the water or hauling them up and torturing them for information and then dumping them back in the water. But the less said about that, the better. But broadly, most of the other navies, they would do their level best to rescue people from the sinkings that they themselves would cause. So that's when Bismarck sinks Dorsetshire's, they're picking up survivors. When Scharnhorst sinks, you've got ships immediately looking for survivors in the water. Hipper's captain gets a glowing report from the British for basically turning around and fishing survivors from Glowworm out of the water, almost even before Glowworm herself has slipped beneath the waves, and so on and so forth. But sometimes you end up in a situation where you feel you can't, for whatever reason, continue your rescue efforts. So at Matapan, it was the risk of air attack. And in some other cases as well, you have either ships thinking, right, well, I can't risk my entire ship's company. The reason Dorsetshire leaves, for example, is they think they spot a periscope, and the Dorsetshire's captain concludes that, yes, there are hundreds of men in the water, but if I stick around stationary and a U-boat torpedoes me, there'll just be hundreds more men in the water, which doesn't help anyone. And sometimes with you have things like U-boats who, if they've sunk a ship that's got several hundred crew, they physically can't take on several hundred people. So where, for some reason, the captain of a ship feels he can't rescue these survivors, almost always the next thing they do would be to either get directly on the radio or, as Jamie mentioned, or get some kind of message sent to somewhere else that could send a message to tell the other side, look, this has happened, you need to go and get someone out there to rescue them, and we're not going to interfere with those rescue efforts, because there's nothing to be gained by blowing up a hospital ship.
I mean, and of course, fortunately, it's extremely rare. But on the other side, you do have the opposite kind. You do have those who, as you mentioned, will machine gun or shoot or torpedo people that are already in the water. I think was a British submarine captain that was court-martialed for such behaviour in the Mediterranean. So it fortunately generally very, very rare. But sometimes you do get people that, shall we say, are just far less than
He was court-martialed for trying to order it. His crew actually refused the order, if I remember correctly, and his XO relieved him of command immediately. And it wasn't. It's one of those things when it happens, and I think there was also a similar case in the German Navy with one of their. I'm not sure if it was one of their destroyers or one of the submarines, but again, their crew actually stopped them, and the court-martial goes with the crew actually against the senior officer when they ordered this, because it's an illegal order, and it's not something that basically most navies have the policy that once you're floating and bobbing in the water,
your flag has come down. Yeah.
You're no longer a combatant. If your flags come down, yes, that can be. But if your flags come down and you're still firing, your guns or your guns are still moving, that's the thing. We've shot your flag away, but you're still fighting. Okay. But once you're bobbing in the water, yeah, definitely not a combatant anymore.
Okay, we are slowly running out of time, but I will quickly scan the questions.
I definitely want to get onto formidable firing at night. Because if it's correct, it's the only example of an aircraft carrier fighting from the main battle line of a battle fleet.
And it's it is the case
that
Admiral Henderson, the Third Sea Lords, two of his carriers have done unique things. In that Formidable is the only carrier to have been involved in a fleet action firing at the enemy, and HMS Unicorn, the not an aircraft carrier, honestly not an aircraft carrier, forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. It might look like the template of the light fleet carriers, but that's only because of you not having imagination. She's honestly a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. Please don't, not an aircraft carrier. of course, carries out some land bombardment in Korea when some artillery decide that they're going to try and engage her, so she fires back with her 4-inch guns. It's what these carriers get up to, and forward aviation support ships.
So in this situation, it's not. I can't say I'm certain that it's happened, because in no official report is this mentioned, and in very few senior or ranking accounts is it mentioned, but there is a very, very detailed and lucid account in a book called The Fleet Air Arm, Voices in Flight, of a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve by the name of Camplin. And he was the gunnery director of B Director. Now, the British armoured carriers had 4 dual-purpose directors, one for each group of 2 4.5-inch mounts. This is, again, something unusual for the time. It was the ability to split fire against multiple directions of air attack was something that's very important. Later in the war and after in the war, the illustrious class had a very, very powerful anti-aircraft fit for the early war stage. Anyway, so he was on the port side, the B grouping, which is the front left of the ship. So he was on the action side of Formidable, the side that was actually facing the enemy. And his account is that, there was Formidable in the battle line. 600 yards in front of her was Valiant. 600 yards behind her was Barham. The searchlights ignite, spot the ship, and Formidable begins to turn out of the line because she didn't want to get shot at. But no one had actually issued the order to the gun directors not to open fire. And there he was, one of the gun directors of B turret. And his account is very clear that they get off one salvo before the bridge of Formidable remembers, oh shit, we're not supposed to be firing. Quickly get on the phone to the gun turret directors. So the depth of detail of this from this account and the position of the account giver makes pretty certain in my mind that yes, this probably did happen. Yeah, whether it was effective or not is another matter altogether, but you got to remember that Formidable was just as close to these cruisers as were the battleships.
And you've got to remember that the Royal Navy did not want its carriers trying to get stuck into surface gun action, so this probably goes a long way to explaining why it wasn't included in a lot of the more comprehensive and official reports, because with the Royal Navy, if you put in an official report, even if you say don't do this is a very bad example, a lot of Royal Navy officers are going to go, but you can do it.
And this set the precedent, yes.
It has
and you
been
have to
done.
remember, the precedent itself starts off with, I wasn't ordered specifically not to do this, so I did it. And therefore, then if it's written up in a report, it becomes a precedent. Well, if no one has specifically ordered me not to do it, I can do it until ordered otherwise. And that's not a precedent you want going around the Royal Navy. They're aggressive enough going on at this period. You do not want that precedent.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same situation as with the demise of Yamato, when the carriers were ordered to withdraw, but nobody ordered them not to launch strike, right? Still, I think Mitchell waited until the strikes were in the air before informing Spruance that the strikes are happening. So, just to be sure.
That was because the radio crews were all busy coordinating the launch of the aircraft. That's just because the traffic was overloaded. It's not. It wasn't Mitchell planning it at all. No. No, that wasn't. Nothing to do with that. Nothing.
Yeah, as they say, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So.
Yes. But the other side of this story is that it could have gone so terribly, terribly wrong.
Yes.
The only reason why this action happened was because Formidable was there. And the reason why Formidable was in among the battleships was because she was very, very vulnerable to attack. So there are a couple of destroyers there in support of those Italian cruisers. Torpedo. They see a carrier, they're going to go for it. Just like in the game, you see a carrier, you go for it.
Exactly. I mean, given the situation, if Formidable was detached and she with few destroyers of escort ran into Polazara Fiume and their accompanying destroyers, it would be very, very unfortunate, probably, because while by all accounts, the Italian cruiser crews were utterly surprised and not expecting the action. I mean, there's only so much the few escort destroyers would be able to do in time. So
well, this is when you get into the whole finding of a reconnaissance by fire at night thing, which of course there is two methods the Royal Navy has trained its ships, well, some of its ships, in how to locate targets at night. And that's one of the interesting things, because you have Greyhound at the front of the formation of the battle line. She's of course using her searchlight. But if she'd been a tribal class destroyer, they had been training since 1938 when they started in a new technique, which a guy called the captain before Vian, who commanded the 4th flotilla, or the first tribal flotilla, Creswell, had developed, which was to use the 4.7-inch guns on his ship, firing high explosives, to highlight a larger enemy ship, so that instead of using a searchlight, they would use the explosions to illustrate it, and they could either locate use their torpedoes and fire them at the enemy highlighted by the explosions going off from the 4.7-inch, or a battleship could use their larger guns to focus in. And the idea was you would fire your 4.7-inch and them going off, even though they wouldn't pierce the armor and wouldn't have anything, them going off would clear the decks a bit, but they would highlight and illuminate the target for another ship or using torpedoes. So the fact is, if she had been on her own, she would have probably actually had these tribals with her, in which case there could have been a whole different interesting scenario we could be talking about, which could have been rather like the Battle of Cape Bon. But of course, the tribals at this point didn't have their radar fitted. They were going to get it quite soon, so of course it wouldn't be full Cape Bon. But and then you go from you can look at the Battle of Cape Bon, which is rather interesting. So another night action where three Royal Navy destroyers and a Dutch destroyer, the A6 Squares, if I remember correctly, go up and manage to get round some Italians, attack from the land side, and the aft two destroyers, which are a J class and the A6 Squares, basically don't get to be involved in the fight because the two Italian cruisers are surprised so much by the hail of fire coming from the two tribals in the front, and they're illuminated by the 4.7 inches. So even though you don't have you have radar directed guns, you don't have radar directed torpedoes. The fire from the guns illuminates them, so that they manage to launch their torpedoes straight at these ships.
Yeah, one of the things you've got to remember is that when the Royal Navy are closing the distance down to this insanely point blank range, it's not just because they can and they want to get they just want to get a sort of effectively an execution going. It's because, once again, they know and respect their opponent. They know that, they could open fire at 9,000 yards, 6,000 yards, something like that. But at that range, where hits are somewhat less likely, there is every chance that if you let your opponent, in this case the Italian cruisers, survive long enough, they might recover from the shock of suddenly being in searchlights and being fired on and start firing back. And once they start firing back and launching torpedoes of their own, then there's a chance that your ships get sunk.
Even if they don't start firing back, they lay smoke, and they make it that much harder to find them at night.
Yeah, and this is the thing. If Formidable was on its own or with some destroyers and runs into the Italian cruisers, the simple fact is that Formidable doesn't have the guns, and to be honest, even the Tribals and Formidable combined, they don't have the guns to suppress a pair of Italian heavy cruisers fast enough before the Italian heavy cruisers would be able to turn around and go, hang on a minute, something's up. We should be doing something about this. Big, massive carrier-shaped target. This will get us a few medals.
That's
it would entirely be dependent upon the destroyer's torpedoes. That would be the entire thing. It would be, and also this is the weakness of the Tribals because they only have one quad of torpedoes. So, and then they'd have to reload them. It's not going to be a good. It's basically you hope you get your 4 torpedoes and you hope they hit both. The 8 torpedoes from 2 destroyers hit both targets and take them out. If they don't, get at least 2 torpedo hits for each cruiser. And even then, that might not take them down quick enough to take out the carrier. So it's a night fighting is a complicated thing, and having a doctrine for it is a very difficult thing.
Yes, that's actually that again reminded me, like basically the parallel development case where the Japanese night fighting doctrine was that you launch torpedoes first, so that the enemy doesn't know, and you open fire with guns only by the time the torpedoes should be reaching them. Again, for the same reason, that you don't alert them to your presence ahead of time. But in any case, I think we have time for one last quick question, a quick one, from Vice Admiral Laffy on Twitch. Theoretical question: would the battle have gone differently if in some entire historical situation the Aquila would have been operational and been present? And I have to say not likely, because like even if you have a carrier operational, that doesn't necessarily mean you know what to do with it, and that's a big problem.
It's not going to help them at night, and even during the day. If you assume Aquila has all the various fighters and everything they were planning for it, without radar, the Italians are going to face exactly the same problem that we were discussing earlier. Of they see the strike, but at the point they see the strike, it's too late to actually do anything about the strike. The swordfish and the albacores are going to be there. They're going to be dropping the torpedoes before your fighters are warmed up and off the deck. Now, granted, they may be able to then, if they can fight their way through the Fulmars, they may be able to engage and shoot down some of the swordfish on the way back, but that's not going to do any good for Pola and Vittorio Veneto because they will already have been hit.
Yeah. And otherwise, they'd have
advantage.
A cap. Otherwise, they would have a cap which was reliant on visual guidance and visual detection, which, as we saw in Midway, was not exactly a great way of defending your fleet.
I would say the biggest.
Actually, if you have Aquila taken out, the thing is, if you have Aquila taken out or damaged earlier, that could actually, because she would have been the primary target for the Fleet Air Arm, they would have taken her out before they focused on Vittorio Veneto. If they manage to damage her so she's slowed down, that then slows down Veneto, which might have then got her hit. The British, it might have turned into an even bigger win for the British, because they might have, that if they slowed the Italians down early enough, far enough away from Italy, then you might well find the British get up there and manage to have an even bigger battle.
Yeah, like or in my eyes, the biggest probable contribution of the any aircraft carrier on the Italian side would be the scouting. But even then, that would be problematic, because while you can spot enemy, that also means that he sees that there are planes around that don't look like land-based planes. So it's kind of double-edged sword.
Look, I think ultimately it would have given the Italians a very similar effect as what it gave the Royal Navy. A carrier is a mobile air superiority bubble. So you control the air above your fleet, you can defend your fleet, you can provide reconnaissance around your fleet, but you can only do it while your carrier's there and your carrier's operational and your aircraft are operational. So it would have certainly helped with the confidence of sending out a fleet and especially if you knew you were going into an area that was otherwise being denied by opposing aircraft.
Yeah.
I think our time's up. We are actually we have made up for the late start. So I think it's time for the final statements. And actually, since I see the question from Crazy Locha, let's start with Dr. Clark. And the question is: new book out when?
The new book is supposed to be out at the end of this month, beginning of next month. It's supposed to actually come out next week or so, a couple of weeks or so. There have been some small issues delaying it, but not much. It should be out soon. Basically, it's been slowed up by COVID because everything takes longer because everyone's working from home, and my editor's been lovely. I have to admit, the editor who I've been working with for Pen and Sword for the book is a lovely person. And one of the interesting things I find is the way Pen and Sword, who I'm publishing with, do this is that I don't know their name, I don't know who they are, and they don't theoretically know who I am. Although I spend so much of my life talking about tribals, battles, and darings, if there's anyone in my field who doesn't know who this probably book is written by, then I'd be surprised. But so I get these lovely messages from them, and they go backwards and forwards, and it's all fine. It's coming out, as I said, it's within days or days, maybe a couple of weeks, but very, very soon. It's good and fun.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, Drachenifel.
Yes.
Any final words? Parting statement, invites.
Well, only parting statement would be to further my own little personal crusade to get people to realise that the Italian Navy was a serious and well-respected fighting organisation, and definitely not the pushover that pop history makes it out to be. They suffered some reverses, they had some successes, they had some handicaps, but at the end of the day, the Royal Navy were their opponents, and the Royal Navy credited them as a perfectly fine fighting force, so you can't really say much more than that.
By the way, the chat noticed the Corellian corvette behind you.
Yes.
And that biplane, is that a swordfish?
Yes, that is.
Yeah.
That was named by one of my live streamers as Stabby the Swordfish. So he features in all my live streams.
Okay. And Jamie, you are last but not least.
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess what it comes down to is there's always a massive context of things going on around the headline event. So Matapan, everyone knows about the night battle, but it took an awful lot to get to that point, and that involved a day-long fight from the cruisers. It took a day-long chase from the battleships, and it took constant dashing in and out of the battle line from formidable to launch, everything from strike groups down to reconnaissance aircraft. And you had Crete swordfish that were left over from HMS Illustrious being damaged. They were, pitching in as well. And look, everything there's just so much is going on. And just to leave you with a one image of just how determined fighting people can be, is that of HMS Warspite's float plane. I believe it was a swordfish. It was up there spotting for about 3 or 4 hours, and it was it had been told to fly off to Crete because Warspite was charging headlong, but it wasn't released in time, and the swordfish pilot radios back to Warspite, look, we're running out of fuel. We haven't got enough fuel to get to Crete. So the solution to this was that while Warspite was charging along at its maximum full speed of 20 knots because it had sucked in sand and its condensers wouldn't allow it to get up to its full speed of 24 knots, they decided that, okay, what we'll do is we'll land this float swordfish ahead of Warspite. We'll make the swordfish power towards the enemy at 10 knots, and Warspite will come up behind it at 20 knots and hang out the crane and just pick up the swordfish as it passed by, because again, Cunningham was just not going to slow that battleship down in order to reach the enemy. That one shot worked. They had a guy on top of the top wing of the swordfish, grabbed the hook, got it into the hole in time, lifted the swordfish up. They were aboard for an hour. They grabbed enough time for tea and biscuits and refueled the plane, and they were off again. They relaunched, they were recatapulted, and they were in the air until after dark, spotting for Warspite. So, yeah, look, these things don't happen without efforts like that.
And
by the way, the
I
chat
would-
noticed the Dalek behind you.
Sorry?
And the chat noticed the Dalek behind you, and now it's exterminate, apparently.
Yeah, I've got.
Also,
got
earlier
my-
they spotted the Colonial Viper out on the shelf.
I've got my favourite things there. I've got the Spitfire, the Dalek, the Viper, and HMS Formidable versus a Kamikaze on the background there.
Okay, so just to stress again, if you want to know anything about armored carriers, especially the British ones, visit this website or search for armored carriers on YouTube, on Twitter, and generally anywhere on internet, because you are bound to hit the proper site. Well,
If you want to hear that account of that swordfish, I just put it up recently on my YouTube channel. The pilot recounted his experience there.
okay. Yes, so look for Armored Carriers, the YouTube channel. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for stopping by today. Thank you for spending your time with us. And it's been a fun discussion. It's been an interesting topic, often overlooked. And yeah, we will now have to decide what will be the next Armchair Admirals topic. But I feel that it's highly probable that it will involve HMS Warspite again. She got around a bit, so
Yes,
but,
she did.
Yeah, that's the April topic. So we will announce it soon, and we will, as usual, give you a warning on the portal. We will give you option to ask us questions, and we might even expand the opportunity to ask us question to other platform, but we will see that. Once again, thank you all for your knowledge. Thank you all for stopping by, and it's been fun. Let's hope that we will meet again on this little chat.
Yeah.
It's fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And yeah. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for your questions, even for those that we didn't manage to answer, because there was a lot of them, and quite a lot of them interesting. I think we managed to go through the most interesting ones. And see you around next time. Have a good evening, and bye-bye.